Keanu M. Jackson's in the house, y'all. Keanu M. Jackson, psychotherapist, educator, a brother, a friend, a colleague. Man, I'm so excited to talk to you today.
Yeah, me too. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. On this show, we talk about obviously Black men and mental health, but you're the first therapist that I'm having on the show. No pressure. But you're the first therapist, and I want to cut to the chase because immediately, when we have these conversations about mental health, particularly in the Black community amongst Black men, the question that I always hear, I'm a therapist in training too, but
Mhm.
the question I always hear is, or the statement is, we don't have enough men of color. There's not enough Black male therapists, right? Um, how did you get into this work? And can you speak to that idea that there are not enough of us in this work?
Oh my gosh, yeah, absolutely. So my introduction into the field, it kind of felt a little random. In a lot of ways, I kind of feel like I kind of fell into it, and I say that primarily because I didn't really have like language, right, towards like what it meant to be a therapist, like what it meant to be a person who wanted to help others. So I grew up in a all black community in South Florida, and I felt very lucky because I grew up in a household that really just like emphasized and supported my curiosity. And so I was always, always, always asking questions about like what I was seeing, what I was hearing, what I was experiencing. And I began to really notice that um, there were just like some specific things that were just impacting Black folks, impacting the Black community. And I really knew that I wanted to like hop in there and try and figure something out. And so, I attribute I attribute my first like introduction into like understanding what mental health was through watching Law and Order SVU. They had
Wow.
the forensic psychologist, and I was like, oh wow, that's so cool. I want to get into that. And so, like, long story short, I ended up going to college, majored in psychology, then discovered the social work profession through a colleague, and everything really just started to fit together for me. I realized, okay, not only do I want to advocate for mental health and to really do my part in supporting the community, but I also wanted to um, tie into racial equity, understanding just how oppression's impacting all of us, understanding like white supremacy and the nuances of all of that. And everything has just connected so well, leading me to Columbia to get my master's, keeping me in New York, and then doing my full time therapy work and some of like my racial equity stuff on the side too. So it's been interesting. I thank my community for being incredibly supportive of just me and really just allowing my curiosity to flourish, as I mentioned previously. I will say, as far as folks of color, Black men specifically within the mental health field, I really didn't realize there were so few of us in the field until I got to graduate school. Um, and when I was in grad school, I would walk into class and I would say, "Oh, I am quite literally the only Black man in
Yeah.
most of my classes,"
Yeah.
which is very jarring, especially being in a place like New York, right? And so I quickly discovered that there were a lot of barriers of access when it comes to not just folks who are seeking services, but for folks like us who want to be in the profession. And so for a while, I definitely questioned like my position within the field. There was this question of whether or not I was capable, whether or not this was the field for me, whether or not this could be a place where I could thrive. But I am very happy that I stuck it out, and very excited to continue this conversation because there just needs to be more of us in these positions, in these spaces, having these conversations. And not only do we deserve to be here, to be visible, to be engaged and present, to be honest, in my opinion, I believe that Black folks, queer Black folks, folks of color in general, people who are being directly impacted by all of these systems, I think that we quite literally are the backbone of the way that this profession is going to just transform over time. And I think that that's very beautiful, and that we get to tap into that.
Yeah, I think what you just said is extremely prophetic and accurate in terms of we are part of not only the population of folks needing to be served, but also part of the population serving, right? And that's going to bring about our healing. You know, you mentioned something really interesting about the framework of your practice, having this racialized, informed practice and awareness when working with folks. I know the work that you do centers on body healing and healing the Black body and our relationship with our traumas
Mhm.
through the body. Um, what what would you say is sort of like those core practices or principles that people come to you for support for?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I will say that folks like see me for a variety of different things. However, one of the standouts, one of the threads that I've been able to identify is that like a lot of people are really just um, experiencing just like a lot of urgency in different ways. Folks are living in these like survival states, right? They are on the go, they're on the move, constantly being, just pushing against just an incredible just like amount of pressure and burden, et cetera, et cetera. And so one of the things that come, that folks that come to me for is like, okay, well, how can I really just give myself an opportunity to just not have to do that? I
Mm,
have to be this very specific person in so many aspects of my life. Like, how can I just be me? Right? How can I
mm,
understand who I am outside of all of that? Right? How can I give myself access to something different? Right? And
mm,
so for me, like my therapeutic practice is really focused on, okay, well, let's like nurture this like therapeutic relationship in such a way to where we can explore and be curious and get to discover and introduce or reintroduce you to that person that may
mm,
have had to take the back seat um, in some capacity just for you to survive. Like, let's imagine what would it be like if we didn't just have to survive, right? Let's talk about
right.
thriving. Let's talk about living in our truth. Let's talk about existing in our joy, existing in like our liberation, and what does that look like, and how can we access that even
Mm,
momentarily.
And, you know, I when I hear you say that, I think about the Black experience, right? And by and large, BIPOC communities across the United States who have been, you know, the center of so much harm and oppression
Mhm.
historically. And so when I hear you say like that reclaiming, that re-ownership of self, transitioning from a place of survival to a place of thriving, right? Like I think
Mhm.
so many people feel discouraged. They feel discouraged
Yeah.
by their plight, what life has handed them, right? And so how do you, I guess, both validate a person's experience, right, living in in these systems and experiencing oppression while also empowering them to actually thrive when that might seem impossible for some people?
Mhm. Yeah, and it's tricky, right? Because from my experience, like from my practice, right, a lot of it comes from being able to name um, and to accept like what is happening at that time for a lot of us, a lot of Black folks. I mean, I'll speak for myself. You know, there has never really felt like there was opportunity for me to say, actually, yeah, like this is really hard for me to do right now. That's not to say that I can't do it, but it's just like, dang, like I just wish that someone just knew that I am struggling. It's gonna get taken care of, but I really am struggling.
Mm,
And so what I really try and do with my people, right, is ask them, okay, well, how can we just acknowledge just the reality? Let's acknowledge the truth, right? Let's like pay attention to how we are really being impacted, you know, not as a way to discourage or to make you feel weaker or to feed into these like beliefs or anxieties that perhaps you are, just like incapable, unworthy, et cetera, but say, okay, let's talk about, how much you've done already and
mm,
give yourself access to support, right?
mhm,
Both in
mhm.
those like crisis, emergency, urgent situations and in the situations where you're just like, actually, I just don't got it today, and that's fine, right? And so
Right.
it's a very intricate, interesting sort of like dance where I find that for a lot of folks, one, it's very, 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 very hard to admit, oof, yeah, this actually isn't the vibe for me right now. Because for a lot of folks, that that admission, right, could result in some level of harm or some level of, you know, access or resource being taken away. And so it's
Mm.
really about how can we build that trust? How can we establish that rapport? Slow it down a bit, make these assessments, name what's happening, and also ensure that we're surrounding ourselves with community, with folks who can give us a moment, right?
Mm.
To really just acknowledge and to really just be more than what is expected of us to be.
Yes, yes. I think you hit on such a critical point there, which is the admission to feel differently than what we're trained to feel, right? Or the admission that we can be both strong and struggle.
Right.
That this idea of holding multiple truths. So in your therapy practice, what are just some of those practical tools that you can say for anybody who may not be able to right now get into a therapy office, find a Black therapist, find a Black queer therapist? What
Mhm.
could people start doing right now to begin to work on themselves?
Yeah. So I am a therapist who, listen, I fully believe in the art of journaling and the art of storytelling, right? And so something that I encourage folks to do frequently is, well, let's like think about the story of you, right?
Mm.
Let's think about the story of yourself. Like what is the story that you tell yourself, that you tell other people, right? What is what is the story that you're trying to live up to? What is the story that you would write if you had full control, right? And really just like encouraging people to think about um, just think about their own personal narratives and how to really just like tap into that inner author as opposed to just being a character in someone else's story. And I
Ooh,
have
that's good.
found and I have found that for some folks, especially for folks who only see me for a consultation or see me for a few sessions and then realize, okay, like maybe it's not my time yet. I have folks who have come back who've been like, actually, like that was a very useful tool for me. It gave me a chance to see myself as myself. It gave myself an opportunity to just create, the story of me, the story that I wish other people could see, the story that I hadn't been able to show myself for some time. Um, and so yeah, that's like a big tool of mine. Just the journaling, the storytelling, prompting, giving yourself full range to be as imaginative as possible.
Yes, no, I love that, and I love the approach that you use and the wording of that you use of like what would your life look like if you had full control, if you had full autonomy, and that's a question that I think most people are not asking themselves, right? We're kind of just
Mhm.
like going through the motions. We have our roles and our responsibilities and the things that we're expected to do, and we show up to the job and we show up to the whatever. But to really have that space to sit with your own self and say, what would my life look like if
Yeah.
I had total control? If like no one needed me for anything, right? Which is like a very, I think, especially for Black folk, it's a really hard thing to do to
Mhm.
not imagine ourselves, without taking care of other people or outside of that community. Now, I want to go to when someone is ready for therapy. How does someone know that they're ready?
Oof. 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 I'm gonna be honest, I don't have an answer for that question. I just don't. Because
Yeah,
I don't think that answer is the same for everybody. You
right.
know, there are some people who go to therapy for the first time because they experience a particular event or trauma or something, right? There are other people who are literally mandated for therapy and mandated not just by like systems, but mandated, just via, their social environments. Like you have a partner, for example, who's really encouraging you to try out therapy, or like a friend or a loved one. You know, a lot of therapy is also trial and error. You might really click with the therapist at first, and then session 4 you realize, okay, this person is seeing me a little bit too quickly,
Mm,
or you might not vibe with the therapist at all, and you might be very like resistant, like, I don't want this person to know my business, or I haven't been able to share my business.
right.
And so something that I really try to encourage folks, especially if they're curious about therapy, is to let it be a messy process, to let it be an opportunity to just like figure things out. And also, consultations typically are free. You can look up therapists who give like free consultations, and perhaps you vibe, perhaps you don't. However, what you can also do is ask that provider when you're on the phone with them or you're, on a call with them, hey, like, what are some other, like therapists who I can look out for, like who's on your referral list? Okay, how do you practice with people with XYZ needs, right? At the end of the day, a therapist is there to support you in whatever way possible, and you can literally show up and ask them questions. Part
Yeah.
of our role is giving information, referring out to like other providers and getting folks connected, because at the end of the day, we want to make sure that people do have a level of access. So I say, let it be messy, let it be confusing, let it be trial and error. And once you are booking consultations and you're meeting therapists for the first time, yeah, ask those questions.
Mm.
Um, ask those questions, because that's literally what we're here for.
Yeah. I think sometimes people are like intimidated by the whole process of finding a therapist. Like there's all these different ways now that people can find a therapist. But, I got to be honest, some people have been disappointed, right? They've been hurt, they've been harmed. Therapy has not been an exciting experience for them. And so, what can people do to not just find a therapist, but also like it's kind of like dating, right? So like, what are those
Mhm.
questions that people should be asking? What are those things that people should be looking out for when they're looking for a therapist?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have a list of questions, or a list of answers, rather. Yeah. So I always ask people, cool, like, think about, first off, what is your budget for therapy looking like? And
Ooh,
how frequently are you trying to meet with a therapist? Right? Those two questions already can kind of narrow things down a bit, right? If you know that you are a person who needs like sliding scale, for example, right? You can just say, okay, cool. Like, do you offer a sliding scale? If so, like, what are the different, like, what are the different quantities, or do you take insurance? No? Okay. Cool, cool, cool. Now I have information around that. Got it.
mhm,
Do you know of any programs or any resources that can help me to pay for therapy? Right. Are you connected, to anyone else who, works with like black men, black queer men in particular, right?
right.
Um, Something else that you can ask a provider is, okay, well, what excites you about the work that you do? What led you to becoming a therapist? What
Hmm.
does a typical session look like? Right?
Mm,
It really is like dating. Like, it literally is like dating. You're going to
yeah,
be building a relationship with this person, albeit a professional one, but this is a person who you're going to be spending a significant amount of time with. And so you can approach it as if it's a first date. And if it works out, it works out. And if it doesn't, then that's also fine. Except, except you get a lot of really cool and really good information out of that too. Um, in my consultations, I always encourage people, I'll be like, hey, if you find another provider, or if you do need help in wanting to like, look for a different provider, you can ask. It's okay. I'm not going to take offense to it. Like, that's just what the
yeah,
name of the game is. I'm not the therapist for everybody, right? And not everybody's the client for me, and that's literally fine. Let's
right.
try and see how I can support you in making sure that you are getting what you need, or getting a little bit closer to what it is that you need.
I think that's such a healthy and beautiful response because like if I were on in the process of finding a therapist, which I've done this enough times to like do it for everyone else, but like that process can be overwhelming, right? And so people may feel that like, oh, if I'm once I invested all this time and energy into building something and I feel like it doesn't work, I don't
Hmm.
want to walk away. But what you're saying is like you may not be the appropriate therapist for everybody, and I think that's so refreshing to hear from a provider because it tells us that like no, the relationship is not just one sided, and just because you've invested 10 minutes or a consultation doesn't mean you have to commit. So
Hmm.
really refreshing to hear. So I also want to go to this idea, and I hear it a lot in Black community. I know you hear it too. And that's this idea that like we don't need therapy, right? Like we don't need it. There's also fear, right? Fear to open yourself up, particularly as Black men. I think that can be a very vulnerable thing, a very difficult thing for us to do to just be vulnerable with someone else. Um,
Absolutely.
so can you just speak to that and some of the fears that come up and even some of the distancing from therapy. Is that okay? Is that normal? How do we pay attention to that?
Yeah, so I will start off by saying, I do not blame any Black person, for distancing themselves from therapy, not trusting the process, not being too informed of what the process looks like at all. Primarily because let's be for real, right? The medical institutions in this country have caused deliberate harm to the Black community. And for a lot of us, that distancing has had to happen in order for our ancestors to literally survive. And that is valid, right? And
Yes.
also, the mental health field has actively contributed to that too. And what I will say is that there definitely are and have been active attempts to restructure, reconfigure, to really change the game, So what was back then isn't what's now.
Mm,
And to be honest, I feel like a lot of us need to be in therapy in some capacity, right? And I don't think that therapy is the only form of healing, because that's literally not true. Like, community um community care is incredibly important. People have like their religious services, like folks have, their close-knit friends and family. However, at the same time, there are also just like trained professionals who can be unbiased, who can give insights, who can give information regarding particular like frameworks to help you to really just like navigate this in a way that can be, I don't have like the perfect words for this, but just a way that can just literally just be more centered on like you, period.
mm,
And so all that's really just say, I mean, I remember like growing up, and mental health was not even like a part of the discussion. There's
right.
always this like expectation that we just have to shoulder it. We just have to keep pushing. We just have to, keep going, right? And
Hmm.
I've seen the memes online, right, where folks now are like, yeah, like, I'm telling my mom I'm depressed, and she'll be like, depressed the dishes. And it's like, yeah, like it's funny, but also like, no, like let's talk about the fact that, a lot of us have been harmed in some way, not just by like our communities, but also just by the systems that are impacting our communities. And it's not our responsibility to answer to those institutions and systems. It's not our responsibility to just have to figure that out for ourselves. Like, no, like we deserve to be able to offload that somewhere else. We deserve to be able to have committed, effective, nurturing, compassionate, unbiased care too.
Mm,
And that means finding providers, finding therapists, creating a care team of health professionals who can do that for you.
mm.
Um, I could keep going. I have so many thoughts on this.
Well, I have a follow up question to this because I heard what you said too about just like first of all, therapy is not the only form of healing. There are other ways, including community gathering and other modalities, right? And so the other question I have though is when you go to a therapist, right, as a black man or as a black queer man, is like could I go to a therapist who's a white woman or who's an Asian man? Like, how important is it important at all? Like, if I say, okay, I can't find anybody who's black and queer, so I'm just not going to go to therapy. Should I be giving up in that process?
Hmm. No, you should not be giving up in that process. Although, yes, trying to find a provider who has similar identities as you can be very useful. It can create like a level of kinship or a feeling of kinship that can make breaking into the therapeutic process feel easier. At the same time, there are also really talented, really skilled, really informed therapists who do not have any of your identities, who may be exactly what you need. Um, I have worked with a bunch of people who who many of whom have stated, "Oh, well, previously I had worked with like straight white women." And of course I would ask them about how that experience was, and folks, but yeah, like at first I was very nervous. I didn't expect to really connect, and then next thing I know, 6 months down the line, that relationship had blossomed into something far beyond what they had initially imagined. And so I tell people all the time, hey, like if you find a provider who you even think, okay, let me just give this a shot, I think that that can, like, even that can be just like a beautiful, beautiful way of like engaging in the therapy process. And also, just because you find a therapist, it doesn't mean you have to stick with that therapist forever. Like
Mm.
people do eventually look for different providers. So I say if you can't find a person who matches exactly what your identities are, like, yes, like look for someone else, consider somebody else. And also, just because we share the same identities, it doesn't mean we have the exact same experience.
Absolutely, that part. I mean, that's yes, that is revolutionary. And when I finally understood that, I was just like, oh, it's actually more important maybe that I actually just work with someone who has the skills to do this work with me than to be so hung up about skin color, hair type, and body type. You know what I mean? Like things that are actually not so much about the process, but maybe more about my sense of comfort into the process, which is
Mhm.
important, right? But shouldn't be
Right.
the end all be all to getting care, to getting help. So
Yeah.
we've talked a lot about mental health. Now I want to move to talking about Black men and Black masculinity.
Yes, please.
Okay, just I mean, just let's just start here. Like, do you love being a Black man, and what does being a Black man in Keanu's life and shoes like? What is that journey and process like for you?
Oh my gosh. I listen, I really love being a black man. Like I do. I do. It's I find a lot of pride in being able to just be who I am, and really finding a flavor of manhood, a flavor of masculinity that that truly is just mine. It's so freeing being able to know that, I just get to choose like what my manhood looks like. I get to choose what my masculinity looks like. And it's taken a lot of processing, a lot of my own healing, a lot of my own understanding to really get to this point. But yeah, I'm at a point now where I can say, yeah, I love it. Love it, love it, love it. I would say that being raised under boyhood, um, particularly in like my Floridian town, was very interesting. Um, so I was raised in a household for the longest time. Like I was the only guy in the house. It was like
Mm,
my mother, her mother, and then my two sisters for a long, long time before my younger brother came along. But even then, like we have a 10-year difference. So throughout my upbringing, like by the time I was off to college, he was only 8 years old. So
mm-hmm.
for a large part of it, it felt like, it was me. And because of that, I used to hear a lot of, oh, well, you're the man of the house, right? Which as a
Right.
kid, I was like, wow, that's so cool. Like I get to be in this adult role at the same time. Now that I am an adult and I'm able to look back, I'm like, oof, I really see why that type of messaging can contribute to additional stress, can contribute to feelings of like personal responsibility, especially if there's like stressors that just exist either within the household or stressors that are impacting the household. Um, and so for a long time, I had a very complicated relationship with being a black boy who then was tossed into manhood too soon. In
Mm,
a lot of ways, I feel like my childhood stopped at around like age 10 or
wow.
11. Because I can distinctly remember that around that time, like that's when people were treating me more like a man, right? Where people were not seeing me as a child anymore. Um, and I had for a long time a lot of resentment towards that. And also, as a person who's undergoing his own healing process, I get to tell myself that, oh well, I can still tap into like my childhood. I can tap into that sense of wonder
Mm,
whenever I want to. But it was very complicated at first, very, 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 very complicated, especially with being like a queer person too,
oh, I'm
because
sure.
a lot of the ways in which I existed and navigated, just like throughout my upbringing, didn't necessarily fit in with like the typical like boy. Like I was really smart, athletic, you know, involved, with like the arts. Um, However, it never felt like I quite fit in a way that folks wanted me to. Um,
Yeah.
and so, yeah, there's like a lot around there that we can continue to get into, but yeah, it's been an
Let's get
interesting
into
process. It's a
it.
very interesting process. I know that's right.
Yes,
Let's
let's get
go.
into it. I mean, I think that unfortunately, there is such a pressure in the Black community. And, Keanu, with our practice, part of my internship, role was working with families. And, I hear this narrative often in working with our
Mhm.
community and just being a Black person, that you're the man of the house. Like, your job is to take out the trash, or your job is to wash the car, or your job is to do this and do that. And your sister's
Mhm.
job and the niece's job is to wash the dishes and to do this. And we're so stuck in those roles, that role playing, right? And not realizing that we're setting young boys and young girls up, to not find the uniqueness in their identity. And
Mhm.
so, and I grieve for when I hear you say that you feel that part of your childhood was cut off too soon. What would you say to parents who are raising young Black boys today, whether they're a single mom, two parent household, single dad, or just a unique blend of a family? How can that family unit, those guardians, provide a type of support for the child to allow that young Black boy to emerge into the
Hmm.
person being that they want to be?
I love this question because it just means that I get to talk about my mom a lot, and I love talking about my mom.
Hi, mom. I love talking about my mom too.
So I really do believe that my mom was or just is still a great example of what it means to really just like emphasize like letting a child be a child. And so although I felt like I grew up too soon, I never got that from my mother. Like that was not like an in-house thing for me.
Sure.
I felt like I was aged because of the environment and because how people outside of the home, were interacting with me. And so
Mm.
something that my mom did and continues to even do now, even though I am quite grown, but she always reminded me that that I was a child. You know, it was never a, oh, you need to take care of XYZ thing, or you have to do. It was always, you are a child.
Hmm.
And as a teenager, that used to annoy me because like all I wanted to do as a teenager was grow up. I wanted to be 18. I wanted to do, all the things that like the big kids did. I wanted to move out. I was in a very angsty like time of my life that resulted in my mom and I like butting heads a whole lot. However, looking back, I was like, oh no, she was very committed to really allowing me to literally just be a child and just have as much of my innocence as possible before the world decided that it was going to snatch that up from me. And so, what I would have to say to parents, to guardians who are raising Black children, who are raising Black boys, is really try and remember that, these are children, that they get to be children, and that, outside of the home, there are people and there are systems and there are forces that are dedicated to aging them up against their will. Do whatever
Wow.
you can to ground them in their childhood as much as you can. Let them be joyful. Let them be curious. Let them explore. Let them make mistakes. Let them, figure it out. Let them just experience childhood in whichever way they can. And in those tough moments where the world is trying to show them otherwise, you can offer so much love and guidance and support and literally just letting them know that it's okay and that it's okay for them to not know. It's okay for them to be confused. It's okay for them to feel, you know, whatever feeling is emerging for them. And that it's it's their role as children. Like like they can just do that.
Yeah.
Um, and so, yeah, that's something that my mom and even like my dad, to like an extent, really emphasize and prioritize, which I really appreciate in the both of them. I think it's gotten me a really long way. Um, so yeah.
And I don't hear you saying that it's not important to teach children responsibilities, or, I think that's sort of the pushback against, well, I want my child to be strong, and I want my child to be responsible, and I want my child to know what it means to have a job, and like how to do all those things. And like, again, unfortunately, like some of those desires to have a child become a certain adult, right, is putting a lot of unnecessary pressure on the child. And so I think what I hear you saying is that yes, all those things are also true, and yet the child has an imagination. The child wants
Hmm.
to play. The child deserves to be happy and feel like a child and explore who they are.
Hmm.
Yes. So, I want to offer for Black men who are listening, um, an opportunity for them to think about the kind of man that they want to be, right? We talked about boys becoming men. And now I want to just transition to men becoming better men. What can
Hmm.
Black men do today to improve their wellness, improve their self care, improve their relationships, um, begin their healing journey? What are some of those like step by step principles that a Black man can do today to become a better Black man?
Oof. This is a heavy question. Okay. Okay.
Sit on it.
Yeah. Right. Right. Yeah. So this came up in like a workshop I did recently, where I was helping just like queer men of color just like reconnect with like their inner child. And so I do a lot of inner child work, particularly just because I love to laugh, I love to giggle. That's my thing. Um,
Yeah.
but something that Black men can do in particular that I think can be incredibly, incredibly beneficial is understanding that through learning how to be more vulnerable, through learning how to be more um, accepting of your feelings, just more vocal in general, try your best to understand that there also may be a moment where the people in your community may call for accountability, and that calls for accountability is not rejection.
Mm. Can you say that again?
Yes, 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 yes. Calls for accountability is not rejection.
Mm.
I find that for a lot of us, we we are shown time and time again that our sensitivity isn't really considered. We're expected to be, either stone cold, or that, we are assumed to be incredibly aggressive and angry, which again, emotions are emotions. We have a full range of feelings. Learning how to, look what's underneath that anger, learning how to look what's underneath, this like tough exterior that we are, conditioned to create, one can be very revealing. It can be very raw. And sometimes we may find out that there are things that we had done or things that we had said that actually hurt somebody that we care about deeply. And a
Yeah.
person making that known does not mean that they are rejecting you. It does not mean that they don't believe in you. Doesn't mean that you're any less than of who you were. It doesn't mean that seeing your emotions and being vulnerable was a mistake. Part of healing and repair and building that community is learning that there are going to be moments that our emotions are just going to feel a little heavy, and that our behaviors can impact others. So I always just want to encourage other Black men to take those calls for accountability as invitations to create and to nurture, long-standing, healthy, and supportive relationships.
Yes. Wow. That is some powerful advice. And to be quite honest with you, I think that some people can hear that and say, well, I just don't know where to begin with that. I don't know what a healthy relationship looks like. I don't know what it means to be a healthy Black man. And so, I think that part of what you're saying too is that vulnerability, that stepping into the unknown, and being able to, maybe right some wrongs or ask for forgiveness. You may not get it back, but that's okay, right? Like that's not a rejection. That is actually you stepping into your higher self, you giving yourself space to explore what it means to be a more free version of yourself.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah, I hear you loud and clear. So Keanu M. Jackson, y'all, is just changing the world, going places. Keep your eye on him. Where can folks find you?
Yeah, yeah. So folks can learn about me from my website, keanumjackson.com. Or if they want to stay in touch with some gems I drop on Insta, they can look me up at the Black Queer Therapist.
Period. Keanu M. Jackson, y'all.